This girl had personality, she had hope, she had dreams, she had aspirations. She really deserved to be heard, and the court process completely obliterated her voice. And now she's gone, and so, my role is I'm going to try to be her voice.
On February 7th, 2020, Jennifer Kagan reluctantly sent her 4-year-old daughter Kiera off for her scheduled time with her father. Reluctantly, because after almost 4 years of fierce litigation in which Jennifer had told the court repeatedly about the abuse she had been subjected to by her husband, as well as her serious concerns about Kiera's safety when she was in his care, he continued to have frequent, lengthy, and unsupervised time with her, as ordered by the family court. Her reluctance was well-founded. 2 days later, on February 9th, Kiera and her father were found dead at the bottom of a cliff in Rattlesnake Point Conservation Area near Milton, Ontario. As tireless as Jennifer was during Kiera's life in her efforts to keep her safe, she has been even more so since her death, calling for accountability on the part of the systems that so clearly failed her and her daughter, and advocating for changes to the law and legal processes so other mothers and children can have happier endings to their stories.
There were clear red flags in terms of the abuse, the pathological line, and that was all just completely ignored and deemed to be irrelevant to parenting, when in reality I'm of the view that it is very relevant to parenting, that if someone has a history of abusive behavior towards one spouse, what can happen is they can then use the child as a tool by which to harm their ex-partner. And that's exactly what happened in this case. Kiera was a means by which to get at me, to get his claws into me, to harm me, to cause me, as much emotional strife as possible. And he knew very well how to do that.
The Domestic Violence Death Review Committee in Ontario identifies 41 factors that indicate a case is high risk for lethality. Where there are 7 or more factors, the committee deems the death to be both predictable and preventable. In Kiera's case, the DVDRC identified 22 risk factors. A sobering reminder of the urgent need for systemic change to end domestic violence deaths. Welcome to the Season 4 premiere of the Learn to Love podcast. You are now on air with HWP. I'm your host, Jerusha Mack. This podcast, presented by Halton Women's Place, is dedicated to conversations that educate, inspire, and build a future free from violence. This new season brings you insightful discussions and powerful stories that highlight the realities of domestic violence, aiming to educate, shed light on the challenges, and inspire change. In this episode, I'm joined by Pamela Cross, a feminist lawyer and member of the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee. Pamela is renowned for her work as a researcher, writer, and educator with women's equality and violence prevention organizations across Canada. We talk about the important work that the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee does and how we can prevent deaths like Kiera Kagan, because domestic violence deaths are preventable. Hi, Pam. Thanks for joining me today.
I'm really happy to be here, Jerusha.
Yeah, I've been really looking forward to having this conversation with you. For people who may not be familiar, can you explain what the primary purpose and function of the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee is?
I can, and I want to take a couple of minutes to do that just because the committee has recently, a year ago, been reconstituted with a bigger mandate and broader scope than it used to have. So I want to make sure that listeners understand that. At its essence, the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee is part of the Office of the Chief Coroner of Ontario. And its job is to assist the Chief Coroner in reviewing domestic violence-related deaths after there's been an initial police investigation, after all criminal proceedings, including appeals, are complete. So we look at a death sometimes many years after it's happened because the criminal system in this country moves very, very slowly. We would look at a case more quickly if the person who has caused the death has also killed themselves, because then, of course, there wouldn't be a trial. And what we're looking at is not the personal, criminal, or civil liability of the person who committed the murder or anybody affiliated with the story in any way, but rather we're looking at systemic issues. that perhaps have some responsibility for leading to a situation where somebody's killed by their partner or their former partner.
Mm-hmm.
And our job is then to make recommendations about changes that could be made so that further deaths would be less likely to happen. So the DVDRC has been around since 2002. 2 inquests that happened in the 4 years before that, inquests into domestic violence homicides, made a recommendation for this kind of a body. Because what those inquests saw was that while certainly the person who killed the other person is ultimately responsible for their own actions, often there were many, many surrounding circumstances where system interventions might have led the story in a different direction. So that's the essence of what we do. The scope that we have is big. Domestic violence related deaths, that's a big term. What does that mean? And what we're now looking at is a wide range of situations where, and I'm going to use a quote from our actual description. So we review any deaths where violence or abuse by a person's current or former intimate, dating, or sexual partner, or violence or abuse by someone who has had, or has expressed a sexual or romantic interest in the person likely contributed to the death of the person or an associated person. Okay, that's great. That's total gobbledygook. So let me explain it in a way that makes sense to normal people like all of us. Mm-hmm. So what do we mean by a current or former intimate partner, dating partner, or sexual partner? That includes a broad range of relationships. Some of them are obvious. People who are or were married. People who are or were living in a common law or dating relationship. Even if that dating relationship was only casual, it's covered by this broad term of current or former partner. Our scope also extends to someone who had a consensual or non-consensual encounter with the victim at any time, and someone the victim may have dated online, even if they've never met in person. But it goes even farther than that. We also look at situations where the perpetrator of the homicide has currently, at the time of the homicide or before that, had or expressed a sexual or romantic interest in the victim. So I might not even know this person, but they've developed some kind of obsession with me. Mm-hmm. And then they kill me. We're now including that in this scope of domestic violence related deaths. A death is considered a domestic violence homicide if the perpetrator attempted or intended to establish an intimate relationship with the victim, even if their advances were rejected. If that person perceived there to be a relationship, even if that feeling was not mutual. So it could just be as simple as the perpetrator being infatuated with the victim.
Yeah. The work that the committee is doing is really important. I'm not sure if a lot of people even know about the important work that the committee has been doing, so thanks for explaining that. But it's so important because it's a huge part of prevention, because a lot of domestic violence deaths or intimate partner deaths are preventable. I remember hearing someone one time at one of our functions saying, or one of our events saying, well, what can you do about it? Almost saying as if it's inevitable, but this isn't inevitable. And normally when you think about, they're thinking, oh, well, that's happening behind closed doors. That's their issue over there. Like, what do you mean systemic issues? But systems can actually prevent deaths. And sometimes, like you're saying, there are a lot of systemic interventions that can help save lives.
One of the things that I think is really important, and this is a conclusion the committee reached, long before I became a member of it, is that the vast majority of domestic violence homicides in Ontario are both predictable and preventable. And yet we always act so shocked when we hear about it. We see a story in the news, or even the police will say, or neighbors will say to the media, I had no idea. Well, a lot of the time people have no idea because we're not paying enough attention. And I want to be really careful how I say this, because I don't want people to listen to this and think, oh, now we have to be paying attention, sticking our nose in to all of our neighbors' business and our coworkers and our family members. No, that's not what I'm suggesting at all. Mm-hmm. And just because you overhear somebody having an argument with their partner doesn't mean that you have to think, oh, one of them is going to kill the other one. But I think that we've become very good at not seeing what's obviously in front of us, not seeing patterns of behavior that make it clear one person in the relationship has a lot more power than the other. Not being open to hints that somebody might be dropping, say a colleague at work, saying, oh, things are really difficult at home right now. A lot of us shy away from asking, do you want to talk about that? And I understand that. It's awkward. It's not our business in some ways. But most of these deaths are, first of all, predictable, meaning the signs are there. And second of all, preventable. Also I think it's about 7 out of 10 cases, the presence of family violence or domestic violence, IPV, was known to multiple individuals outside the family. The woman may have said something to the family doctor, to a religious leader. Teachers may have observed or heard things from the children. There may have been 1 or 2 or 20 calls to the police, maybe none of them raising an issue to the level that a criminal charge resulted. Or maybe there have been criminal charges that have been resolved without ever going to trial. And so it doesn't show up on the abuser's criminal record check, that kind of thing. So we know it's going on, even if we don't know that we know it's going on. And if we know, we have to learn about, what to look for, what's our duty as people, just people, not because it's a family member or a friend, just as people, because we would start to see the rate of violence, especially lethal violence.
Absolutely. Can you share what are some of the most significant findings or patterns the committee has identified over the years?
The fact that in the majority of cases, the death is both predictable and preventable. The fact that people know about the abuse, where the break happens, is that we don't know what to do with that information. And I want to say, because this is what I do, I guess I'm considered to be an expert. All my work is on this issue, but I am as unsure as probably many other people about what to do in a situation where I'm confronted directly by a relationship where I can see that there's a significant power imbalance. If I encountered 2 people on the sidewalk in front of my house later today, and if one of them was hitting the other one, I know what I would do. I would dial 911 and try to observe what was happening to keep the victim safe and keep myself safe. But if I saw something that wasn't quite that physically obvious, but that ticked a lot of my boxes of red flags in terms of coercively controlling behavior, abuse of power, that sort of thing, where it seemed that one person was afraid of the other, I don't know what I would do. Because my fear would be that if I intervene, they're still probably going to go home together. And is it going to be worse for her then when they are, as you say, behind closed doors? Is he going to blame her for the fact that I stuck my nose into their business? I'm not suggesting I wouldn't do something, but I think it's important for people to understand it's not easy to know what to do. You're not a bad person if you can't figure out what to do. I think there's some great tools for people. I think Neighbors, Friends, and Families, for example, is a fantastic program. Lots of helpful resources to let people learn what are some common red flags. How do you have these very awkward conversations with people? Julie Lalonde has done some terrific work and does training for bystanders so that people know how to intervene in a way that's safe for everybody. But a lot of this work has come out of the work of the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee, in the sense that the committee has said, hey, folks, we can predict these deaths and we all need to have a role to play. And I guess in some ways, that's what I think it is the most significant finding, is that in the end, yes, we need to improve systems, and I'd like to talk about that as well today. But in the end, a lot of it comes back to us, all of us being better informed and understanding that we have a role to play in making our communities safe or safer places for everybody who lives in them.
Yeah, I agree. When you listen to stories, there's a lot of patterns in terms of like the lack of adequate intervention, whether it's by systems or just people that just don't know. Sometimes you're thinking, well, I don't want to get into their business, or I don't want to, like, that is, there's this thing that's from, since historically, that it's been like domestic violence is like behind closed doors. That's their business, none of my business. But intervention is so important in prevention. And that can happen from people that are, whether it's your coworker, like you're saying, or family member who knows to recognize the signs and knows how to have those conversations, so that you're not sort of saying, oh, you need to leave them. Are you stupid? Like, why wouldn't you leave? And being that judgmental way. But it's really important for all of us to know how to do better, for sure.
I think if I compare it to another social problem, whether that's drinking and driving or smoking cigarettes, what has happened over the last 20 or 30 years is that we've developed a culture, a social culture, in which people aren't afraid to talk about it. So a kid doesn't feel awkward saying to their grandparent, you shouldn't be smoking cigarettes. Now, that might not necessarily stop the grandparent from smoking cigarettes, but would that kid say to their grandfather, you shouldn't hit grandma? Probably not, right? So we need to become as comfortable having conversations about this as we have about other issues. Or maybe a better example would be COVID. People didn't hesitate during the high crisis time of that pandemic to say, where's your mask? You can't come in my house without a mask. How about you can't stay at my dining room table if you're going to keep making those sexist or racist jokes, right?
Yeah. Our executive director, Lori, often gives an example of with recycling. So amongst youth today, like if somebody taking a water bottle and just throwing it, like people would be like, well, you're supposed to recycle, right? So making it almost as that simple where it's just not acceptable that whether you're in school, that you're saying inappropriate comments or making jokes and displaying those unhealthy attitudes and behaviors, that somebody feels comfortable enough to just call you out on it. And making it that simple. For sure, I agree.
And I mean, you say making it that simple, but I think we have a big task to get to the place where it's that simple. And podcasts like this one, I hope, are part of just raising general awareness, making people feel more comfortable with the topic, making people think, oh, I don't have to be an expert to be able to be helpful. I just have to be a person who cares about my family members, my coworkers, my friends, my neighborhood.
Yeah. You mentioned before that you wanted to highlight what were some of the systemic changes. So in your opinion, what are some of the systemic changes needed to better prevent domestic violence deaths?
Can I go back a step before I talk about that just talk about some of the key risk factors that the DVDRC has identified? Because I think that will flow into, okay, here are the risk factors. What systemic changes do we need to make? I feel like it's a really great time to have joined the DVDRC because they've got 20 years of solid work behind the committee before the new ones of us have come along. And a big piece of that work was to develop a really helpful document that listeners can find just by Googling risk factors for domestic violence Ontario. And you can get this chart that sets out 41 key risk factors. That was developed over those first 20 years as they looked at, well, what are we seeing the most often when we look at these deaths? And there could be more. Maybe 5 years from now, there will be 47 risk factors, or maybe something that was a risk factor 10 years ago just isn't showing up as much. So all of that is to say this isn't a static list. And just because something's on the list does not mean that the woman is about to be killed by her partner. And just because something's not on the list doesn't mean you shouldn't be paying attention. Usually the risk factors are more than one. So for example, in one of the deaths I recently reviewed, there were more than 30 risk factors present. I've also reviewed deaths where there have been one or two. So it's sort of all over the map. Obviously,
Yeah.
the longer the relationship, the more isolated the family, the more risk factors there will be, because it's less likely that there will have been any kind of outside intervention. So what are some of the most compelling risk factors? I went through that list of 41 before we talked, and I picked not what I would call my favorites, that would be a weird way to do it, but ones that might catch people by surprise.
Yeah.
So the first one, and maybe this isn't a surprise to lots of people, is the second most common risk factor. The most common risk factor is a history of domestic violence. So we don't really need to talk about that. But the second most frequently found risk factor is a pending or recent separation. Well, this places a woman who has a partner who's abusing her in a really difficult situation. And you know from your work that women are often judged for not leaving sooner. You know, why didn't she leave? Why did she stay for so long? Why did she go back? But in fact, leaving escalates the risk of lethal
That's the time
violence.
they're most at risk for being killed.
That's right.
Yeah.
And not even just when they leave, but when the abuser perceives that she's about to leave. Mm-hmm. So maybe she has a new sense of purpose. Maybe he's going through her phone and he notices that she has a lawyer's phone number there. You know, there could be a variety of ways where he would come to perceive that she's planning to leave. So once he thinks she's leaving, or as she leaves, very high risk factor. And I would just add, although this isn't set out explicitly in the risk factor chart, what we're seeing more and more often, many of us in our work, is that couples stay living in the same house even after they separate, more frequently now than ever before. And so think about how much more that's elevating that risk. You've already got the risk factor of separation, but she doesn't have the safety of living in a different location. So that was the first. I picked about 10 of the 41 that I thought I would share with folks. That was the first on my list. The more isolated the victim is, the more vulnerable she is to ongoing and lethal violence by her partner. And of course, isolation could mean geographic isolation, a woman living in a very small community or in the far north, somewhere where there's nobody around or there's a lack of services. But it doesn't just mean geographic isolation. She could be isolated culturally. She could be in a situation where leaving her partner means leaving her cultural community behind. And there may be no services that are what she feels to be culturally safe for her to turn to. She could be linguistically isolated. So lots of different kinds of isolation. And of course, some of that isolation may have been built, in effect, by the abuser. He may have moved them to an isolated location on purpose so that there wouldn't be neighbors around to snoop, in his mind, into their business. Or he may have made it difficult for her to attend English as a second language classes, or may have forbidden her from working, and so on. There are some kinds of physical abuse that are bigger risk factors for lethal violence, and strangulation is one of those. A partner who uses strangulation even once, but particularly on an ongoing basis, that is a situation that's at a higher risk of becoming lethal. Where the abuser has attempted to kill himself or has frequently threatened self-harm or threatened to kill himself, another risk factor. So it isn't just if he threatens to kill her that we should be paying attention. We need to pay attention if he's threatening to kill himself. If you ever leave me, I'll kill myself, that kind of thing. Obviously, if he has access to weapons, in particular firearms, but firearms aren't the most commonly used weapon. In rural settings, they are. Really, access to any kind of weapons. If his behavior is becoming increasingly obsessive, if he's becoming more and more jealous. So let's say these two people have been separated for a while and he's just found out she's dating somebody new. That elevates the risk that he might become more abusive, up to and including lethally violent. If there are mental health issues that have been unidentified and or are untreated, lots of people with mental health issues, even serious mental health issues, are no more at risk of harming another person than you or I. But it's when that mental health issue has not been identified. or even if it has been, the person isn't able to access services, that there may be a correlation with violence. Where there's a child custody dispute, we know that many abusive men who are fathers are extremely possessive about their children. They see them as part of themselves, really, and they are not going to let the mother, even if she's always been the primary caregiver, play a significant role in the children's lives. So if there's a court case going on, especially if it's not going well, in his opinion, that elevates the risk of a possible lethal violence. And the last thing I'm going to mention for now is this. You and I and many of the folks listening to this know that we have to listen to survivors. That survivors know better than anyone else what's happening. Many tend to underestimate the risk of lethal violence. Yeah, he hits me, he beats me up, he controls me, but he'd never kill me.
Yeah.
When a victim has an intuitive sense of fear, every red flag should be waving in our heads at that point. Because often victims try to underplay the seriousness. So if anybody has a friend or a family member, or they're working with someone who's saying, I'm terrified, I'm sure he's going to kill me, we need to listen to that very, very carefully and make sure that we're doing safety planning with her that understands that her fear is rooted in something, even if it's nothing concrete that she can tell us about. So those are a few of the 41 risk factors. As I said at the beginning, it's not a definitive list. There's other things to pay attention to on the list of 41 that I haven't mentioned here, and there are other factors beyond those as well.
Mm-hmm. So at the beginning of the episode, I mentioned Kiera's case. I was sharing that story with the listeners. And I know with the DVDRC, where there are 7 or more factors, the committee deems the death to be both predictable and preventable. And in Kiera's case, the committee identified 22 risk factors. However, that being said, there still wasn't any heed being paid to Kiera's mom's concerns and for her daughter's safety. So I think that sort of leads us into what are some of the systemic changes that we need to prevent cases like this from happening.
That's a really good segue. And to build on that case specifically for a minute, and then look more generally. One of the things I learned from getting to know quite a bit about that case and getting to know Kiera's mom, Jennifer, is that the biggest systemic change that was needed there was to have proper education for judges on the topic of intimate partner violence. And I have to say that due to Jennifer's incredible efforts since her daughter's death, both the federal government and the Ontario government have passed legislation to create more likelihood that education will be there for judges. And I think that's a huge, huge step. Many of us who are advocates in this area have been calling for that kind of legislative change for 20, 30, 40 years. We've been getting nowhere. And Jennifer's work in, just the past 4 years has really moved the bar really, really far on that. I'm hopeful. There's a long way to go yet, but I'm hopeful that with that legislation, a door has opened. That is a door to a huge systemic change that has the potential to be really helpful, not just in terms of the deaths of children or the deaths of their mothers, but in terms of how judges understand intimate partner violence generally when they're making decisions about how families should organize parenting responsibilities and so on. More generally, when I think about systemic change, I start by thinking about the importance of seeing this as an all of society issue. It's not a women's issue. It's not a legal issue. It's not a criminal law issue. It has health components. It has housing components. It has basic income components, right? We have to look at it in its broadest way. I think that's one of the very helpful aspects of the recommendations that came out of the CKW inquest in Renfrew County in 2022. The first, I think it's 7 recommendations deal with system accountability. And they talk about the importance of an all-of-government approach, but also of collaboration among and between different levels of government and within government between ministries and departments. Because that really is the only way that we're going to get solutions that are holistic. It's no good making a change, let's say, I'm just making this up, to housing regulation, if that's now contradictory to how ODSP operates or how Ontario Works operates, right? Because now you've got something that was intended to make an improvement over here, but it can't work because it conflicts with another set of rules over here. And if those people are talking to each other, the changes can be made so that they reflect what's happening everywhere. We need to engage all of us. So we were talking earlier about the importance of sort of neighbors, friends, and families or bystanders. I think that is a huge systemic change that needs to happen. And you see that thread through virtually every report from the DVDRC, looking at different aspects of it. But it comes down to the same thing. We all have to engage. And if I want to think about really big picture changes as a starting point, let's be honest, we need to end misogyny. Women need to have equality in this country. Of course, we need to improve things like how probation is managed and supervised, so that when someone is on probation and they violate any of the terms of that probation, they don't just get away with it. We need to look at bail. Is it working? My answer is no. Okay, so what do we need to do about that? Family law is in better shape than it's been in all the time I've been doing this work in Ontario because of changes both to provincial and federal legislation. So we're making some headway there, but we need judicial education. Women should be able to access housing as soon as they need it, housing that's safe and affordable. And we know that there is a massive housing crisis right across the country.
Yeah.
A woman could be on a priority list, but that doesn't mean she's going to get housed anytime soon. And
No,
so
the
it
wait list is like 2 years.
2 years where you are.
Yeah.
It literally drives women back into the relationship with the abusive partner. Because if she's got kids, she's not going to live on the street.
Yeah.
She can't stay in the shelter forever. So we need to be looking at those big items that aren't necessarily what people automatically think of when they hear the phrase domestic violence or intimate partner violence.
Yeah, no, I think the points that you just raised were so valid. Like I mentioned before, housing is a huge issue for us, especially in our shelter, where the purpose of our shelter is to be an emergency safe shelter. So the point is to take away that immediate risk of the woman being killed by her partner. She has a safe space to stay. But now, where women used to stay maybe 3 months at most, now they're here sometimes for almost a year because there's that stopcock there where they can't get their second stage housing. So that affects our ability to maybe help additional women, and it affects their ability to move on in their healing process and to be able to live independent lives. And you're right, a lot of women sometimes will just decide, because who wants to stay in a shelter? We try to make it as comfortable for women as possible, but at the end of the day, that is a barrier and a reason sometimes why women will go back to a situation that may be more comfortable or familiar to them.
And more manageable for the children, right? I mean, especially if kids are adolescent to teenage years, which I can say, having raised children through those years, is, they can be pretty unpleasant people themselves. And they like things to stay the way they're used to them being. And suddenly moving into kind of a dorm, even if you've got your private sleeping space, but sharing the dinner table with other people, hanging out with other people, not getting to watch what you want to watch on TV, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
The children may be putting a pressure on her. So, I mean, where would we be without shelters? They're, I think, in some ways, the most important resource that we have. But without the backup of second stage housing, adequate second stage housing, or even third stage housing, so that the woman can become more and more independent as she's learning the skills she needs and as safety plans are put in place for her. Without that, you're right. It's just sort of like, I don't know, keeping everybody in the emergency room at the hospital.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. The systemic changes are always a tough conversation. And I think sometimes it can be like so larger for people to figure out, like, well, how, because that sounds hard. How are you going to do that? That's never going to happen. But it's a necessary conversation, because domestic violence is a complex issue and it requires a multifaceted approach. So it's important that we highlight where there are systemic needs for change.
One of the things I find really both frustrating and unclear. I usually have an opinion on just about everything. I think I know, oh, this is what we need to do here. This one, I don't know how to figure it out. We have the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee, which puts out a report every year with recommendations. We have from time to time inquests into the deaths of individual women. Likewise, although this time the recommendations come from a jury, but we have recommendations. So the CKW inquest produced 86 recommendations, for example. Mm-hmm. There's no statutory requirement that those recommendations, whether from an inquest or from the DVDRC, be implemented. And so if you look back over the last 20 years of the Death Review Committee's recommendations, you will see the same or very similar recommendations for systemic change being made again and again and again. Education for judges, more training for Crown attorneys, more training for police, training for family law lawyers, and so on and so forth. And I have friends and colleagues who have been on that committee since the beginning. They're a little frustrated. That's a whole generation. 20 years is a full generation of recommendations. But there's nobody saying, what's the law? You have to implement these. So I think that when we're talking about systemic change, that's something we need to have conversations about. Can we create a requirement that at least every recommendation be reviewed and studied by an independent body, not by the person who's supposed to change, right? There's no point me saying, oh, yes, I know that I need to start cooking better suppers, and I'm the one who will decide whether I'm doing that or not doing that. Of course, I'm going to say I'm getting better at it, right? So when we say, oh, here's 86 recommendations, 68 of them are for the provincial government. We can't have the provincial government the ones telling us, it's okay, we've taken care of that. We need an independent entity. And that is, in fact, one of the recommendations that came out of the CKW inquest. But of course, it's not mandatory. So the government doesn't have to make that change.
And I can imagine the frustration there, because you spend all this time creating these reports and people often will refer to it. But it's what you said earlier, where we're always like shocked, when we're here, like recently the Halton region, along with other regions in Ontario, declared intimate partner violence an epidemic. So there's always this shock about, gosh, like the numbers keep going up. But there's recommendations, there's information about how we can prevent it, but it just seems like there's a lack of will to actually take action and do something about it.
One of the things I found really interesting about being part of the inquest was to hear from people who aren't part of this work and hear how they react to reality. So, of course, the 5 members of the jury were an example of that. And one thing about a coroner's inquest that's unlike a trial in a criminal courtroom, for instance, is the members of the jury get to ask questions. They're not just sitting there listening to the lawyers and the witnesses talk. So they can ask a witness questions. And the members of this jury had lots of questions for the witnesses. And they would get frustrated from time to time. And they would say, I can't believe that nobody has implemented that change yet. Or I can't believe, are you telling me that you're still doing this even though that? And also one of the parties to the inquest, Malcolm Warmerdam, whose mother was one of the 3 women killed that the inquest was about, at a media conference we held, I believe it was at the end of the inquest, he talked about how he had read some of the earlier recommendations from the DVDRC about, I think in particular, gun control, but perhaps also some of the probation-related recommendations that had been made in years past. And then he said, I couldn't believe that I sat in this room for 3 weeks and I heard that none of those changes had been implemented. And if they had been, my mother might be alive today. So I think it's really helpful for those of us who do the work to also be out there in the world where we can hear what I think of as normal people saying, this is outrageous. This just doesn't make common sense. And the fact that you have these recommendations, and they're not just from Ontario, the Mass Casualty Commission report in Nova Scotia, death review committees in other provinces and territories, and indeed in other countries, we're all saying very similar things. But the change isn't happening yet. So we need this all of society approach. We need there to be so much social pressure that politicians realize that they could actually win or lose an election based on how they deal with intimate partner violence. It's not just about taxes, employment, roads. Those are all important issues too, but that this one is right up there.
Absolutely. What are some improvements or changes you'd like to see in the way domestic violence cases are handled in Ontario?
I feel like I've touched on some of that already. I do want to talk a little bit about our obsession, I guess I'll call it, with the criminal law as being the best way to respond to intimate partner violence. I'm not convinced of that for a whole variety of reasons. First of all, these people are not strangers to one another. You know, the criminal law might be helpful if somebody drives while they're intoxicated and they cause an accident that causes harm to strangers, or somebody robbed a bank. But when you have an intimate partner violence case that winds up in criminal court, those two people, the victim and the accused, who are normally kind of on opposite sides because it is a very binary kind of system, they're actually completely intertwined with one another. She may still love him. She wants the violence to stop, but she doesn't necessarily want harm to come to him. She's thinking about the children. She's thinking about the family income. She's wondering who's going to stay with the kids when she goes to work, because normally it's him. So if we continue thinking, as many people do, that the criminal law is the answer, I'm concerned we're not going to get to prevention. I think we may, obviously there are cases where charges need to be laid and where the abuser needs to not be anywhere near the survivor ever again. But that, I would argue, that's not the majority of cases. So I get concerned when I see something like a bill that's making its way through the Senate now to criminalize coercive control, because I think, that's the wrong direction to go. We need to understand coercive control is very relevant in family court in terms of making decisions about parenting and decision-making for kids and that sort of stuff. But why do we just have to keep creating new laws? They haven't worked before. We know that fewer than 30% of women whose partners abuse them ever call the police. Well, why? I mean, I know the answer, but let's pay attention to what we already know. So to me, that's a change I would like to see, is to focus less on criminal law, continue to see improvements made to family law, because if there are kids, there are family law issues by definition. We need to focus on earlier interventions, so we're disrupting the behavior before it escalates to the level of lethality. And one way of doing that is to have more community supports of the kind that we've already talked about, basic income, better housing, and so on. So I would pick those as some of the society-wide changes that I think we need if we want to improve how we handle these cases.
Yeah, if you look at why survivors sometimes they don't leave or they don't want to press charges, you're right. They don't want to, there's an emotional entanglement there. This is somebody they care about, even if they're being harmed by this person. So they wouldn't want to press charges because, like you said, they don't want harm to come to them. So we need a system. And there's so many different examples, even within like the Indigenous community, of how they do healing and reconciliation and restoration without having to make everything that, we need to criminalize this. Because there is some healing on the part of the perpetrator of violence that needs to happen.
Huge. Many of those who engage in abusive or harmful behavior have been harmed or abused themselves in the past. That doesn't mean it's okay. It doesn't give them a pass. Not everybody who's been abused becomes abusive, and not every abuser was abused. But we have to understand that there has been harm often to both people before they even encountered one another.
So we've discussed systemic issues and changes needed to prevent domestic violence deaths. So like the story I shared at the beginning about Kiera Kagan. So for the average person listening, what can they do? How can they become a part of the solution and play a role in prevention?
there is truly a role for everybody. And that might sound like a sort of facile saying, but it's actually true.
Yes, it is.
And the starting place is to find out what's going on. So what's going on in your community in terms of supports and services? What are some of the biggest challenges in your community? Maybe you live in a community where there isn't a shelter and a woman has to go a long distance to get to a shelter, or there's a lack of public transportation, so she can't get around, whatever. So what's the reality of your community? And then I think people next need to learn about intimate partner violence. And there's lots of resources for both of those things. Then they need to look at themselves. What am I good at? So I'm never going to be a public speaker. Okay, that's fine. I don't have to do that. I'm fairly comfortable financially, so I could start to provide some financial support to the shelter, the sexual assault center, whatever. I have some free time. Can I find out how I could volunteer for one of those organizations? And then what we all have to do is learn how to listen really actively, so that when that neighbor or colleague says something to you that just tweaks something in your head, you listen to that, you pay attention to that. And through resources like Neighbors, Friends, and Families, you become confident in how you would follow up. I think we should be talking about this everywhere, not all the time, but there should be nowhere where we don't think about talking about it. If you're in a book club, read a book. It could be a novel that involves IPV, or it could be a nonfiction book, and then talk about it. You're in a church group, you're having a dinner party. Like, people love to talk about world politics and problems in other parts of the world. So talk about your own community.
Yeah.
If your community is one that has declared intimate partner violence to be an epidemic, and there's about 100 of those now in Ontario, find out what the local violence against women organizations are doing next. I know in a lot of communities, they're now working with their city councils to make sure that violence against women or gender-based violence is included in the community safety and well-being plan. Maybe there's a place for you in that work. There really is a place for everybody in this work.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the lines that we always say is everybody has a role to play in ending domestic violence or ending violence against women. What's yours? Because everybody, like you said, everybody has a talent, everybody has a skill, everybody has something that they can contribute. And it doesn't have to be this mass, because again, sometimes we make things bigger, kind of paralyze us because we're thinking of like, how am I going to end it in all of Ontario? But it doesn't have to be in all of Ontario, even all of Halton or all of Milton, but it could be, the statistics are 1 in 3 women experience this. So chances are there's somebody in your life or circle that is experiencing this, and you can be a support to them.
And that is as important as changing a law.
Yeah.
That could change that woman's life. It could save her life.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
you're right. We all know somebody who is being abused and or who is abusing someone else. We need to pay more attention to that fact and then figure out where we fit in their story.
Thank you, Pam, for this great conversation and for joining me and for sharing your invaluable insights. Your work on the committee and your tireless dedication to improving responses to domestic violence are truly inspiring, and we're so grateful for the important work that you're doing. So thank you for taking the time to be with me today.
Oh, thank you very much for the invitation. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Same. Thank you so much.
Take care.
Found today's discussion informative, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and leave a review. Your support helps us continue to bring these important conversations to light. For more information about Halton Women's Place and how you can get involved in creating a safer future, visit our website at haltonwomensplace.com. I encourage you to stay tuned for our next episode, where I'll be kicking off a compelling true crime series that highlights real domestic violence cases. We'll delve into the stories behind the headlines, explore the impact of these cases on victims and their communities, and highlight the need for action, because we can end violence against women. Until next time, let's commit to building healthier communities, one conversation, one action, and one relationship at a time. Take care.